Welcome, everyone. It is so good to see so many friends and experts in the audience and community. My name is Catherine Powell. I'm a non-resident fellow here at the NYU Reese Center for Law and Security and a professor at Fordham Law School. I am thrilled to introduce our speaker and to be in this fireside chat together with Special Representative Desiree Cormier-Smith, the first Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. So I also want to acknowledge our two co-sponsors, the Reese Center, as I mentioned, and the Center on Race, Inequality, and Law here in NYU. And by way of introduction, let me just say that Special Representative Cormier-Smith served as a senior advisor in the State Department's International Organizations Bureau. She also previously worked at the Open Society Institute as well as the Albright Stonebridge Group, so she's got a mix of public, government, nonprofit, and private sector experience. She began her career as a Foreign Service officer in the State Department, so a really wide-ranging career. I want to start by asking you about your mandate. In a sense, this is like a startup with all the excitement and challenges that a startup conveys. Having been a founding director of the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School and Human Rights Clinic, I can very much empathize with the excitement and challenges. No one necessarily gives you a playbook.
Right.
So wondered if you might start by just telling us about your positioning, your mandate.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here and to see some friends in the audience. So my mandate is twofold. One is to ensure that U.S. foreign policy processes, programs, and engagements is protecting and supporting the human rights of members of marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous communities. And that our work globally is combating structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. And the mandate was created not because we have solved these problems in the United States, to be clear. It is because we recognize that we aren't the only country struggling with these challenges. Racism is a global phenomenon that will require coordinated and sustained global solutions to address. And you'll notice in my mandate, I don't use the term minorities, and that is very intentional. We use the term marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities because that is actually more accurate for a couple of reasons. One, globally, we are the majority. But two, in a lot of the countries where you really see racial inequity across society, people of African descent or indigenous peoples are actually the majority. And the case in point I always point to is Brazil, where a lot of people don't realize that almost 60% of the population are people of African descent. Mm-hmm. And you would never know looking at many of prior governments. This government is doing a lot better in terms of representation or media and things like that. Right. And the other reason I don't use the term minorities is because it can be pejorative, right? It can make these communities feel isolated and smaller than what they are. And I appreciate you acknowledging that I'm very much a startup. It is very much true, which is exciting, but also comes with a lot of challenges. This is the first time the State Department has a senior level official leading our work and coordinating our work to advance the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, and to really try and acknowledge and address the challenge of systemic racism globally. However, I joined the ranks of many other specials and ambassadors who are focused on other marginalized communities, including the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Affairs, including the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, including the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, the Special Envoy for LGBTQI+ rights, and the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. So I join their ranks to try and make good on our promise to put human rights at the center of our foreign policy, right. And at the center of that, also make sure that we are acknowledging the unique challenges that marginalized communities face.
So there are so many new people in those ranks that you've just mentioned than 10 years ago when I was in the Obama administration. But your first response was just so rich as I think about, you said you don't use the term minorities. In the US, we're moving toward a country of being majority minority, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. Which is creating some degree of angst, one might say. But the term minority also has a lot of power, right? Politically, even when we think about law, since we're in a room full of many lawyers.
Yes.
But let me ask you just what prompted this position. And I know you mentioned the Ambassador on Global Women's Issues, these other positions. In the Obama years, there was a lot of clamor to coordinate more on civil and human rights, sort of across the interagency. We created an interagency working group on equality, to do this coordination. Tom Perez, who is head of Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, chaired it. We also tried to restart the Civil Rights Commission as a human rights commission, the way many other countries have, drawing lessons learned. But, there was not support in Congress at the time, after the midterms. But, I felt like maybe we didn't get far enough. And you've this is the next chapter. Some of the pressure for us came external. A bunch of us did a Bringing Human Rights Home report. Gay McDougall, others were involved in. So you always think that external
Yes.
kind of pressure.
Yes.
I'm just sort of curious to what extent your position came about from external pressure, internal, or was it a combination of the two?
It was absolutely a combination of the two. This position would not have been created if it weren't for the decades of advocacy that I built upon, right? That includes people like Gay McDougall pushing externally in the U.S. government to make good on our promise to be a champion for human rights abroad and start that promise by beginning at home, right? And that is something that Secretary Blinken often says, and we acknowledge we can't be credible in our efforts to champion human rights abroad if we aren't doing the same at home. So there have been decades of people bringing the alarm, saying, there's a gap here. We are falling short when we don't acknowledge the sort of racial undertones of inequality, of income inequality, of all kinds of other societal ills that lead to instability, that lead to security concerns, right? And I think, in the summer of 2020, after the horrific murder of George Floyd, when we saw this global reckoning on the realities of systemic racism, not just in the United States, but around the world, that was a moment for us to say, State Department, you're not exempt. And the reckoning cannot be limited to the internal workforce DEIA. And at that time, I was on the outside of government, so I was able to be advocating for the creation of this role from the outside. And then when I was asked to join the administration, I continued that advocacy from the inside, but I would not have been successful if it weren't for the sustained outside advocacy.
Right. So, all right, you've just alluded to this, and of course, we don't have to go back to 2020 to think about, Tyre Nichols and just even, every day in the U.S., around the world. I'm wondering how you grapple with your role in promoting these values around the world and U.S. leadership around the world as we're still grappling with these issues at home around race, ethnicity, indigenous people's rights.
Yeah, that was a question that my late grandfather, before he passed away, asked me when I told him I was joining the Foreign Service, right? How dare you go overseas to try and advocate for the very things that we need here in our own community in Inglewood in South Central. And the way that I justified it, what it made sense to me is that we're all interconnected, right? I love the quote, Maya Angelou said it, Fannie Lou Hamer said it, no one's free until everyone's free. And I deeply believe that. But I also don't see the work that I'm doing as a denial of the very problems that exist in the United States, right? And again, I had to justify this to my mother, who was like, why are you going overseas to do this? And I said, Mom, I'm at the State Department. I do foreign policy. So if I say, no, I refuse to focus on racism globally, it's not like then I can just turn and focus on this domestically. I am part of our broader efforts to address racial inequities, starting here at home, but not limited to our borders. And I was just watching a special on former President Carter this weekend, and they showed an excerpt from an interview he did a while ago, actually, when he was in South Africa attending the funeral of former President Mandela. And he was talking about how when he was president, he obviously prioritized addressing racial discrimination because being from his community in Georgia, he saw the impact it had not only on Black people, but on white people and other people too. It harmed everyone. And he said, well, why should that be limited to the United States? Why should my commitment to addressing racial discrimination end at American borders? And I thought, that's it. Like, that's the quote. And that, for me, again, is why I do this work. Because it's not a denial that the United States is still grappling with these. It's an extension. We are grappling with it, and so are other countries. It's not we're grappling with it but so are other countries, right? It is very much and. And as I said earlier, it's a global problem that will require global coordination. And I very much see myself as part of a global community seeking to address this challenge.
So I saw the story in the Los Angeles Times, I think it was, about your grandfather, and it was
Yes.
so touching, and it really reminded me of conversations that I had with my grandparents. So you're touching on this idea of Ubuntu, like the
Yes.
South Africans call it.
Yeah.
Our humanity is tied up with one another's, and you mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer, Maya Angelou. I think of Martin Luther King as well. We won't have justice anywhere until we have justice everywhere.
That's right.
So let me ask about that, because this idea of our humanities being interconnected and our struggle being interconnected is a beautiful and powerful idea, but it's also a threatening one, right?
Yes.
So I want to ask you about the pushback that you may have received, whether we're talking about inside the Beltway, whether it's, voices on the political right or members on the Hill who might have questioned your mandate, and then more globally, to the extent you encounter officials in other countries who deny the existence of racism. And you mentioned Brazil earlier. I'm thinking about the whole myth of the racial democracy there. So both at home and abroad.
Well, when I was asked to take on this position, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I knew that there would be swift and severe opposition. But what I don't agree with is the premise that this is somehow controversial work or political, right? For me, it's about our basic shared humanity. It's about acknowledging the basic dignity and rights of every single human being by virtue of him being a human being. But it's also acknowledging the reality that for people of African descent, indigenous people, Roma people, and other members of marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous communities, their rights are consistently denied and violated simply because of their race or ethnicity. And for me, that's not controversial. It's terrible and something we should address. But our efforts to address them should not be seen as political or politicized or controversial, right? It really is about trying to make the basic premise of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights, a truth and not an aspiration. So for me, even though I expected the pushback, it was hurtful because a lot of it was very personal too. And that's one thing where I think it's silly. Like, if you're going to disagree with me on the policy, fine, let's have a policy debate. But don't, personalize it. And I think that kind of vile, personalized attacks from people who disagree with the premise of this role and other work related to anti-racism, it really frustrates me because it serves to, I think, scare others away from doing the work out loud. And that makes me sad. Yeah. And I see it in a lot of my friends who are at big institutions. Some are inside the government, some are outside the government. But they obviously agree with this work. They're passionate about it. They have the lived experiences in many cases, right? So in many ways, it's advocating for their own freedom and humanity, but they're afraid to do the work out loud because they don't want to be attacked. And I think that's an indictment on where we are right now. I think it's just really, it just makes me very sad that isn't even a consideration that people have to make.
So I agree with you. It feels like politics has gotten more crass over the years, having grown up in the DC area. I mean, it's always been get in there and fight, but at least we don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've seen a stop wokeism at the State Department yet. I don't know, but I don't want to give anyone any ideas.
I'm glad you haven't seen all of the Fox News articles about me.
Certainly didn't delve into them quite enough.
I would not recommend them.
But by, I guess, comparison, and also in terms of the support you get internally, there are these other ambassadors, special representatives, and I'm wondering to what extent y'all work together, at intersections of race and gender, LGBTQI plus issues, disability, and if that's a source of support.
100%. It is definitely a source of support, particularly my colleague who focuses on LGBTQI plus issues, because unfortunately, even though, again, she is just advocating for every human being's rights to be respected regardless of their sexual identity or gender identity, or sexual orientation or gender identity, she has also become the target of some pretty vile attacks. So we definitely support each other. But more importantly, all of us try and work together and collaborate when it makes the most sense and when it really adds value. So for instance, I traveled to Vietnam last year as part of the Vietnam-U.S. Human Rights Dialogue. And I traveled there with my counterpart, Rashad Hussain, who focuses on international religious freedom, because Vietnam is a prime example of where religion and ethnicity intersect to really compound the discrimination that people face. And so there we were able to travel together and advocate for these communities together. And I think we saw that as a force multiplier. Similarly, the State Department just named a special representative for international labor affairs. And even though she's not focused necessarily on a marginalized community that is marginalized because of their identity, she and I have already identified several opportunities where we could be working more closely together, including in Mauritania, where the existence of hereditary slavery still exists, and that's based on race. And it's an issue where, the U.S. government has been working with the Mauritanian government, urging them, advocating them, so as civil society, to end this practice. And on paper they have, but in reality it still exists for many Black Mauritanians. And so that's one where I think we could definitely add value to that.
So we've talked a bit about your partners within the department. I'm sort of curious also about across the interagency, whether other Justice Department or other departments, and then also internationally, the extent to which you work with international mechanisms. We know Biden, has been eager to re-engage with our partners and international organizations. So wondering about that relationship as well.
Yeah. So across the interagency, I have a lot of great relationships, and that's mostly, surprisingly, due to my engagement with the U.S. presentation to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So even though my mandate, yes, unintended blessing, really, my mandate does not have a domestic focus. Again, I'm at the State Department, so I'm purely focused on our foreign policy. However, I recognize that the credibility I have to do this work depends on how we are doing on these issues here at home. And for that reason, I co-led the U.S. delegation to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I think only a month after I was named. But I had been deeply, intimately involved in this process while I was in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs. And that experience actually was incredibly valuable for me because it allowed me to get to know the folks in the domestic agencies who were actually doing the work to eliminate racial disparities through our federal policies, programs, and activities under Executive Order 13985. It also allowed me to get smart on what it is that we are actually doing, which many of my colleagues in the State Department, unfortunately, there seems to be this firewall between our foreign policy and domestic policy. So what I think, the unique value that I bring to the State Department is that I can be a bridge between the foreign and the domestic policy. So let me give you one example. I traveled to Peru last year, and there I met one of the Supreme Court justices who was planning to come to Washington. And when she came to Washington, she and several other judges were very interested in meeting with me to talk about expanding access to justice. And for me, I engage in this work with a great deal of humility. Again, because the United States is not perfect. We are still grappling with these issues. So instead of me taking this meeting to only, hear about what they're doing and give them my thoughts on how they can do better, I said, well, this is something we're also grappling with. So why don't I bring in the Department of Justice's head of Access to Justice office so that you can engage in an exchange of ideas. And it was an incredibly powerful meeting for both sides because they were able to share how they had been trying to overcome the physical barriers to reaching a lot of indigenous communities in Peru. And it actually was kind of similar to what we were trying to do here to reach Native American communities. And so they were able to, share best practices, exchange ideas, and that's something that I find really powerful in this role because, again, I do this work not because we have all the problems, have all the answers, but because we are struggling with the same problem that a lot of other countries are. So when I engage with government counterparts, I come to them with a great deal of humility, and I say, I recognize a lot of these challenges, right? This looks very familiar to me. We are still trying to address it and remedy it. We may have some good ideas, but you may also have some good ideas. Can we begin to have that conversation on how we can do better in both of our countries? That has been incredibly powerful. On your other question about counterparts, now if you asked me this when I first started, I would have said I only have one. But now I have four, so it's great. And I don't know, it's because part of it is because one was just appointed and the other two I just didn't know about. So, but one is the EU anti-racism coordinator, who is phenomenal. And she has the really hard job of trying to pursue and promote anti-racist policies across all 28 EU member states. The other is the Secretariat of Canada's Anti-Racism Unit. And again, his primary focus is also domestic, but he's beginning to crawl into the foreign policy space. I'm encouraging him to come on over to this side because I think there's, the more that we can do together, the better. And then the third was recently appointed in Brazil. Brazil now has, or this new administration resurrected their Ministry for Racial Equality. And the new minister is a wonderful woman, Aniel Franco, whose sister was quite famous, Marielle Franco, who was murdered for her advocacy efforts on behalf of people of African descent and LGBTQI+ persons. So we all talk, we all try and support each other and share best practices, right? Because again, I don't have all the answers. Canada doesn't have all the answers. EU doesn't have all the answers. We recognize that our collective wisdom and our collective power is going to be greater than any one of us as individuals. And then lots of opportunity, obviously, in the IO space, right, in the UN. I mean, it was the UN and the HRC, really led by the Africa Group, that rang the global alarm after the murder of George Floyd. We were seeing protests around the world, but it was the Africa Group, supported by U.S. civil society and global civil society, that said, no, this must be called out. The United States is not exempt from global scrutiny on this issue. And so I'm very grateful for their leadership because these are hard issues. They can be uncomfortable to deal with, but if, again, we are trying to show the value of a democracy that deals with our issues transparently, and if we are trying to be a champion for human rights, we have to do that hard and ugly work out loud and for all to see.
So we have a UN mandate holder or two in the audience, so I can't
we
wait
have
to
quite
turn
a few.
to the audience,
Quite a
and,
few,
which I'm
yes.
going to do in a moment. But let me just ask you a couple other questions. And one is, you sort of alluded to this, is to what extent you think the framing around democracy and fighting against authoritarianism is a useful one for you? And Biden is committed to that.
Yeah.
We could say that the war, the Russian-Ukrainian war, is about those ideas. I mean, you're looking at a piece that helps sharpen that,
Yeah.
and so I'm just sort of wondering to what extent that helps you move your issues.
It's very helpful, honestly. My position is that there is not a single crisis that we're facing today that doesn't disproportionately and differently impact members of marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous communities, whether it be democratic backsliding, food insecurity, economic inequality, COVID recovery, right? And when we fail to acknowledge that, our policies fall short. And so, yes, I very much frame this as a democratic argument. I also frame it as an economic one. And I also frame it as a national security one. And the premise of that argument is basically the same. When you have entire segments of your population that are prevented from gaining access to quality education, which then prevents them from getting job, which then prevents them from providing for themselves and their families, that creates ripe breeding ground for illicit groups, whether they are illicit drug traffickers or terrorist organizations, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, when you have an entire segment of your population that is prevented from participating in the political process and exercising their human right to self-determination, your democracy is weaker, right? And that also can lead to political instability because people are only going to be suppressed for so long. So, I mean, I can keep going, but that's the basic premise of the argument. And depending on who I'm talking to, that's how I shape it for this internal advocacy that I'm still having to do in the building, right? One of the things I'm still, unfortunately, in 2023, having to convince people of is that, addressing racism is not simply a moral thing, right? It's not, we don't do it just because it's a nice to do. It actually is an economic imperative. It actually is a national security imperative. It actually is a democracy imperative. And the more data that I have, that also compels people. But there is a part of me that wishes that it's simply enough to say that people are being discriminated against. They're being, denied their basic rights just because of their race or race or ethnicity. That should be enough for people to say, that's not right, we should do something about it. But unfortunately, it's not.
Right, you've got to be strategic.
Yeah.
So you've talked about your work liaising with IO, international organizations, and I heard you say HRC. I know that wasn't Hillary Rodham Clinton, but
no.
the Human Rights Council.
Human Rights
we
Council.
used to be like, what does HRC have to say about HRC? About the Human Rights Council. I want to ask you about legal. So, again, we're in a room full of lawyers, aspiring lawyers. To what extent do you work with the Legal Counsel's Office, other government lawyers? How do you conceive of the role of law as either helping or hindering? I remember a lot of times the Legal Counsel's Office would come back with, well, here are the options. And it would I was, on the policy side, it's either like, how do we make this work for us? Or, like, how do we work with this whole legal space? So I'm sort of curious about that piece as well.
I, in a former life, I was a lawyer. I actually I was on the path to law school, and then I got the Pickering Fellowship to join the Foreign Service. And I got the fellowship as I was interning for the District Attorney's Office in San Francisco. So I try my best to apply a legal lens, but I can't because I'm not trained. But I have to work with the lawyers. I have to. And I learned that the hard way when I was in IO, right? Because a lot of this work deals with our international treaty obligations, right? So making sure that we are consistent with our ICERT obligations, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Making sure that the language we use doesn't contravene any of those obligations, but also is very specific about how we view human rights, which, can be frustrating at times, but it's also why I always have to say members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, because the U.S. government does not see groups as having rights. They see individuals as having rights. So, and that was something I had to learn the hard way with my colleagues in the legal advisor's office, because, when I first joined the administration, we really wanted to show a complete 180 from previous engagements at the Human Rights Council and in other international fora, and particularly on this issue of racial discrimination. And so I would draft these resolutions, these statements, these things that I thought were beautiful, and the lawyers would just eat them apart. And it was so incredibly frustrating, but it forced me to understand the legal red lines and understand and look at everything with that legal perspective, so that I can get it through. And once we found common ground, they understood the policy imperative, I understood the legal red lines, we're fine. But it is incredibly important to get the lawyers on board, because particularly in the international organization space, they will make or break what we're able to do. And we've seen it a few times. And I've had because of my experience in IO with the lawyers, it's really funny to me because sometimes I will put forward something or draft something and I'll ask my team to send it to the lawyers, and they're like, this will never make it past the lawyers. And I said, but I said members of, so it'll be fine. And shockingly, because again, I understand now the legal red lines, we have been able to do things and release statements that my career colleagues never thought were possible and would not have been possible even 2 years ago.
So, and I saw that you went to Stanford for college and Harvard for graduate school. I know the law was another piece, a potential piece of that.
It was a potential piece.
So I was just talking with a former student who is in government in an agency that shall not be named, but who was talking about similar issues of, she is a lawyer, but she's in a policy role working with lawyers, trying to frame something in a human rights context, but that in a way that raises potential liability for the U.S. And so, we're
Yes.
talking, and maybe there's a way to just, put this in a different light, still using human rights framing, but in a way that, doesn't expose whatever liability. So let me ask you a little bit about that, because I also think I read that you have tried to be very positive in your framing, not so much a naming and shaming approach of criticizing practices overseas, but rather, how can the U.S. not have negative impacts in terms of U.S. funding and also how to support maybe best practices. I know DRL, the Bureau for Democracy, Rights, and Labor, does name and shame, as does, I think, some of the other, like the Ambassador for Global Women's Issues and some of the other positions. So curious about that. Is that a strategic choice or for efficacy purposes, or?
I feel like it's not my job to lecture or admonish other governments about the realities of systemic racism in their country, particularly given the fact that just sets me up for failure, right? Because the easiest and sort of obvious response is, look in the mirror, lady. Like, you guys have a lot going on, and then they just go off and name all of the things. So again, my job is not to do that. My job is to take a critical look at our own engagements in these countries, our own policies, our own practices, our own assistance, and saying, where are we kind of going along with the marginalization of these communities, or worse, making it worse, right? Where are we potentially exacerbating it? And then how can we do things differently to push back on those inequities, on their marginalization? And that is a very different assignment than, the sort of naming and shaming, which I just don't think is effective. I don't think it's effective. And so I think this approach could be more effective. But again, I'm only 8 months in the job, so I'll let you know. The other thing is the real power and value of this role is that it's not always necessary for me to engage with the governments. I really prioritize engaging with the communities themselves. And that has been really inspiring for me. And it's also been quite powerful to see the reactions of these communities. I mean, I've had many of them say, we've never met a U.S. government official, even though the embassy is, not very far. And we've never actually had a U.S. government official ask us about the challenges that we're facing and ask us for our perspectives and listen to us. So that, I think, I'm hoping that we can shift the way we do work, right? Because this role is not meant to be a quote-unquote voice for the voiceless. It's not to take away the agency of these communities. These communities have agency. They have their own voice, and they know better than anyone, including myself, the challenges that they're facing and what they need to overcome them. They've just been excluded from the rooms where the decisions are being made. So my hope is to try and change that. And, I really do believe that in order for this work to be effective and for it to be sustainable, it has to be driven by the ground up.
So let me ask about that, and I do want to go to the audience soon. Just in terms of, you mentioned working with affected communities, and how do you define your metric of success? I mean, on the one hand,
That's a good question.
working on the ground in the field with affected communities. On the other hand, upstream, you've got to, with your higher ups, you've got to, show some concrete results. And, and so, you're one person with a mighty staff, I know, right?
A small but mighty
staff, right? And so you've got to have a multiplier effect, right?
Yes.
So how do you define success for your first year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a tough question. I travel with this UNESCO toolkit to fight racism, and I do that because I think it's incredibly accurate and useful and insightful, but also B, to prove that this is not just a U.S. problem. Now, this was created by UNESCO last year. When we're not members, right? So this is just further proof that this is a global conversation.
We were members at one point, right?
At one point, but last year we're not members.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
We withdrew under the last administration and are trying to. Anyway, so I travel with this. I always carry this with me as my Bible because it talks about the importance of evaluation and how you do it. And what I appreciate about what it says about evaluation is that it starts by asking the community, what has changed for you? right? Including them in your monitoring and evaluation. And I think that is so obvious, but something we don't do enough of at the State Department. Like, just go back to the people you're supposed to be, that you want to help, and ask them, like, hey, we worked with you on this project to address literacy rates, right? What are the literacy rates now? And if that hasn't changed, what can we do? What do we need to shift to actually have the impact that we intended to have?
Yeah.
So that is one marker. The other marker is exactly as you said, like, I have to find ways to have force multipliers. And I'm very glad that the secretary, the deputy secretary, and the other deputy secretary have all said to the State Department that this work is not mine alone. This is not just Desiree's job. It is the job of every single State Department employee to advance racial equity. The challenge is not everyone knows what that means. And so it has to be based on the premise of do no harm, right? And in order for everyone that works for the State Department to advance equity in a way that does no harm, they have to understand what it means, and they have to understand how to do it in a contextually appropriate way in every single country of the world. Mm-hmm. Because even though it's a global problem, it manifests very differently everywhere around the world. So the other thing that this work is not, is it is not applying an American lens to this problem. There are similarities, but it looks, again, very, very differently. And so that's why it's really important that we start by talking to the communities.
Have you thought about doing one of those memos that goes, department-wide?
We
to
have
all the
done that.
embassies?
Yeah.
We've done that. Oh, okay.
Only someone from the State Department would know
I know.
about that.
It's so
But
nerdy.
That's why I never think to say it, because it's so nerdy and not sexy, but it's actually how the work gets done,
It can
right?
be
So
impactful.
this is a cable sent to all diplomatic and consular posts. It's called ALDAC. And we sent it shortly after my appointment to share my mandate, but to also highlight 2 UN International Days that were in August. The International Day for the World's Indigenous Peoples, and the International Day for People of African Descent. So in that ALDAC, we share that there's this new position created at the State Department to address racism and xenophobia and discrimination globally. We also want to flag for you that there are 2 important days in August that you should consider commemorating. Here are some ideas on what you can do, but if you still don't know what to do, go out and talk to these communities and get their ideas and ask them, what would you like to see the U.S. Embassy doing to commemorate your days? So this is going to be an annual practice of my team. And we're hoping that for future, that obviously this will encourage posts around the world to be creative, and also to go out and find these communities and talk to them and listen to them and incorporate their feedback into their programming. The other thing that we did, which is really wonky, so I don't know if I'll get any reaction out of this, but every cable that the State Department sends, either from posts overseas or from Washington overseas, has a tag to let you know, like, this is about political issues, this is about health issues, right? We created a tag. And that, I know, it took months. It took months. But I'm really stoked about this tag, because we'll send another ALDAC, another cable to everyone saying, hey, there's now this new tag. And what I'm hoping that will do is that will encourage people to begin to report on these issues, or begin to apply a racial and ethnic lens to the issues they're already reporting on. And that's how you institutionalize the change. I mean, this is it's wonky, but it's the kind of stuff that if I don't do, all of these public engagements don't mean anything, right? And so I always remind my team, I love being able to travel. I love talking to people. I love getting to engage with the communities. But if I don't do that hard and really unsexy and exhausting work of actually trying to embed this into the State Department's day-to-day work, this will disappear when I'm gone.
What's the tag called?
It's called PRE.
PRE?
Yes, so it's Programs, Racial, Ethnic, Indigenous Issues.
It's a good acronym.
I know.
All right, I got to give you
I
that.
know.
All right, I'm gonna ask one more question that I think maybe will segue to the audience. And so just for audience members, we have people who will be passing around handheld microphones. But I want to ask about the role of these mandate holders, again, some of whom may be in the room. So it seems like maybe the Biden administration is more open to having mandate holders come visit the U.S. You were here, but not you're not actually on a visit, right?
Right.
As you're sitting here in New York. But I remember, there's been discussion of just having an open door policy. I think Blinken has opened the door to one or two probably a couple mandate holders.
No, we issued a standing invitation to all special procedure mandate
Oh,
holders.
that's fantastic. I didn't know that.
Yes.
So let me ask you how these mandate holders can help you with your goals, your deliverables, how they can amplify your work, and then we'll talk to the audience.
That's a great question. So after the Secretary issued a standing invitation to all mandate holders, we are still trying to work our way through a backlog because a lot of them had been requesting to visit, but the last administration did not have any. So there is a large, large backlog. However, we have already welcomed, I think, 3 last year, and I think 3 more this year. In addition to those, we are also welcoming the new independent expert mechanism on law enforcement and racism globally. I'm hoping I got that acronym right. IMLAR, right? IMLAR, yes. And this mechanism was created after the murder of George Floyd in the Human Rights Council with 3 independent experts, including a wonderful, brilliant Black American woman, Dr. Tracy Kesey. And it was created to look at police violence towards people of African descent, acknowledging that this was a global challenge, right? And so we invited them to come visit. I appreciated the fact that they did not want to come to us first. I think that was smart, but I think it was smart for a couple of reasons. And the primary reason why I think it was a good move was because they really didn't want this to be too focused on the U.S., right? Because we obviously have a problem here. We clearly have a problem here. And there's a problem everywhere else. So let me give you an example. When I met with the Minister for Racial Equality from Brazil, she shared her condolences. It was shortly after the death of Tyree Nichols and that horrible video that was released. And she shared her condolences and we commiserated. And she said, as horrible as it is, the police violence in your country, did you know that every 23 minutes a Black person is killed by police in Brazil? Every 23 minutes. And she said, and they don't get this kind of attention. And so that, for me, also underscored why I do this work.
Yep. Wow. Okay, let's go. I want to go to the audience, and we have somebody right up here. I'm going to ask the 2 with the microphones, and just ask that you, say your name, affiliation, if you'd like, and just, keep your questions, ask questions if possible, and relatively concise.
The room full of lawyers. Good luck.
Okay.
Oh.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm obviously one of those mandate holders in the room. And I want to ask you about a problem that we have identified because most of the work on anti-racism issues, whether it be in institutions like the UN and or other such, or the European Union, etc. It is on the old model of accountability and responsibility, which means that it is about a sovereign and the people within that country and the relationship between the two. But the world is much different now. And so when we wanted, as CERD, wanted to address the question of, for example, the or misdistribution of vaccines, there was sort of nobody in the room for us to talk to. We would usually go to a government. But in this case, it was not even in the UN. It was at the WTO that we had to reach to, and we did try. And we also named a number of governments, my own, but was only one of several that held the key to the waiver of the TRIPS agreement.
Yeah.
So, but my point is this: it's beyond what's happening within any one government now. It's even beyond what's happening between countries, you know, within and between countries. There is a whole new interlocking global set of regimes that are controlling our lives and that are reinforcing those deficits that marginalized people of color around the world have already been experiencing, but laying on top of them. So I'm wondering if this is something that you're thinking about, whether it's something that's within your mandate to reach and address, and if so, what do you think?
You had to start with Gay.
I know, right? Just a softball question.
Right. Before I even attempt to answer that, I must just acknowledge Gay McDougall. If you all don't know who she is one of the most brilliant scholars and practitioners of anti-racism work. And she's currently on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And sitting next to her is Majanku Gumbi, who is also another mentor, friend, inspiration, who was just appointed by the UN Secretary General to be his senior advisor on addressing racism in the workplace. It's really an honor, but it's also quite intimidating to have these two women in the front row because I stand on their shoulders. So I'm going to try to address that question, Gabe, but the short answer is that's a really hard one. And I have to, again, with my small but mighty team and the time that I have, try and triage. Like, what are the sort of, not easy wins, because none of this is easy, but what are the things that we can do with a little bit less resistance that will actually have an impact? And then what are the things that will take a lot of effort but would have an incredible impact if we're able to do it? And that's on my list. And that's a longer term goal. But to be quite honest, I'm still trying to figure out how to approach it because, as you noted, it's so deeply entrenched that it's just going to have to be a longer game. But I do find some comfort in the fact that folks are acknowledging that the global system is outdated, right? So I was really shocked and thrilled to hear President Biden in his remarks at UNGA last year acknowledge that the Security Council is outdated. I did not think that was going to happen. I mean, I almost fell out of my chair because, again, it's going back to this internal and external advocacy. That's something that folks have been advocating for, both the inside and outside, for decades. And, you know, one of the frustrating things about being in this role is that oftentimes my internal advocacy is never seen and is not always successful. So a policy that I vehemently disagreed with and really fought against may have gone ahead without me. And folks will never know the internal advocacy that went on behind the scenes. But I always have to remind myself that it is important that I'm there to say those things and put up that resistance, because I'm convinced, and I think the fact that my position exists is proof of the fact that that internal and external advocacy can be quite powerful.
And just to quickly piggyback, I mean, you mentioned the role of being a force multiplier, even if you can't work on all of these public-private issues like vaccine access. But I'm thinking about Mitiange Sirleaf talks about vaccine apartheid.
Yeah.
She just, with Ryan Goodman, who's sitting in the front row here, did a whole symposium on racing security and vaccine apartheid being one of those really key issues.
I will say, sorry, one more thing, but the work of the UN special procedure holders and the independent experts is very important and very helpful, because I can point to that and say, look, they're saying it, you know, the UN special rapporteur is saying it, the CERD is saying it, so that very much helps with the internal advocacy.
I'm looking to our people at the microphones, if you can maybe up here in the front, this gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Wilson from New York City. I have two questions. Number one, I'm from Ethiopia, and the biggest issue in Ethiopia is the climate crisis. That's bringing up a lot of war and ethnic conflict. So what's the country doing, the United States and rich countries, especially after COP27, what are they doing with that? Number two, when I was growing up in Ethiopia, and when Zimbabwe was liberalized, the biggest propaganda by the Soviet Union was about racism in the United States. Even Du Bois went to the United States, I mean to the USSR, you know. That doesn't happen anymore from from the Soviet Union in a little bit. But China, even though they are hiding the Uyghurs issue, they do a lot of propaganda,
Yeah.
especially in Africa, and they are giving money to the African nations. They're opening up their markets. The Road and Belt is giving them a lot of money and billions of dollars and everything. So how do you combat that? I don't know whether you want to call it propaganda, but it's based on some truth,
Yeah.
but they exaggerate it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but they don't talk about what they did.
Yeah.
So how do you combat China in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, two really good questions. Let me start with the climate change issue. This is another example of a crisis that has a disproportionate and different impact on people belonging to marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous communities. And I think we're finally at the point at the State Department where my colleagues are comfortable acknowledging the disproportionate and different impact on indigenous peoples, but they have yet to make the jump to also acknowledge that people of African descent and other marginalized racialized communities are also impacted. So that is part of that internal advocacy work. I'm very glad that we are now getting to the point where there is an acknowledgement that, again, indigenous peoples are differently harmed and they need to be included and incorporated into solutions, but I also need us to begin to make that acknowledgement for people of African descent and other marginalized groups. But that is a huge priority because, again, this is a global crisis that has a disproportionate impact on these communities. On your second question, sorry.
China.
China.
Yeah.
Oh, China. Oh, China. Yes, China. Sorry.
Small issue.
This was something I was forced to confront when I joined the administration and I was in the Bureau of International Organizations, because we saw the PRC, the People's Republic of China, very much on the offensive in the UN spaces, including the Human Rights Council. And they were all over the resolution that was passed after the murder of George Floyd. They were all over this conversation. I mean, they gloated in it, right? And so under the last administration, suffice it to say, we were not positively engaged in these conversations. This administration came to power, came to office promising to be more forward-leaning on issues of race, right? And finally addressing racial discrimination and inequities that have plagued our country for so long, including by having President Biden sign an executive order on day one addressing racial equity. And so that meant our posture on these issues necessarily had to change. And so we couldn't say that we are now an administration that was committed to acknowledging and addressing these inequities because we recognize it makes our entire country less safe, less prosperous, but then shy away from acknowledging that on the global stage. And so we tried this new posture where we would not lean into it, but we would not shy away from acknowledging the challenges that we were going through because we couldn't hide from it. Everyone saw what happened on January 6th. Everyone saw what happened with George Floyd. Everyone saw what happened with Tyree Nichols. What are we gonna say? Believe what we say, but not what you just saw? I mean, that's what the PRC would do, right? And so that became very effective because people saw right through what they were doing and they saw the change of tone in our approach, right? Not absolving us from guilt or from the need to address these things, but it was a refreshing tone for us to say, yes, we have these challenges. We look forward to engaging with this new expert independent mechanism to address racism in law enforcement because we don't have all the answers. And we are hoping that that will help us in our efforts to address these. China, you should probably do the same, right? And so it's like we are trying to lead by example. Do we always get it perfect? No. But it is a complete 180 than how we've previously engaged. And it has been, I think, quite effective because it has then turned the tables on China. So, you know, in a lot of cases, I would get criticized by some who, again, don't necessarily like my mandate or some of the other folks. And they would say, well, she's using China's talking points. And I'm like, they're seeing what we're seeing, right? So, you know, and actually, if I'm using the talking points, then that takes away a lot of their power because I'm acknowledging that I have this problem. So, you know, again, it's not always perfect. We don't always get it right, but we have to acknowledge that we are still grappling with these issues if we're actually going to confront them. And we're hoping that by trying to do that, we can show that we are trying to lead by example.
Hi, I'm also a new special rapporteur. My name is Meg Satterthwaite. I'm the special rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. So I'll give you a softball and then maybe a little bit of a harder one. The softball is just, can you talk a little bit about the challenges facing judges and lawyers who are from marginalized communities? And I'm hearing a lot about this already, just in terms of how very precarious, especially judges are. And then the second harder question maybe is, I'm also seeing really the weaponization of xenophobia by authoritarian governments or would-be authoritarian democratic backsliding governments. And I'm curious to if you would comment on that, but the harder piece is along with Professor McDougall's question, what role are these international networks playing in advancing those xenophobic attacks on communities around the world in advancing authoritarianism?
I don't know if your first question would be considered a softball, but I will try. I must admit, I have not engaged with too many judges from these communities just because in a lot of countries there aren't any. I will note that in the group of judges that I had the honor of engaging with from Peru, there was one indigenous judge, and that was great. But there's a fine line between tokenization and representation. And I'm not going to make any value judgments about whether, how I would classify her in particular, but I do think that is something that we need to be very careful of, right? This work should not be about window dressing. It should not be about putting a token member of X community in a position and then setting them up for failure, or then forcing them to sort of shed their identity as a member of that community in order to succeed. So that's something I would just caution against when I see these sorts of things. And I'm always wary. I'm wary about when governments are really eager to show me their one person. It's just bizarre. And that has happened a couple times, and it was just really weird. On your second question, that network, the network of the sort of wannabe and current and aspiring authoritarians, that network is powerful. And it's something that actually my EU counterpart, on our first conversation, she was like, those guys are united. They use the same talking points. They stick to the messaging, and they're effective. And if we have if we want to have any chance of success against them, we need to pick up some of those notes. And so that's what we're trying to do better. But it's hard, right? She's called the anti-racism coordinator. I'm called special rep for racial equity and justice. People in many countries don't even know or have a word for equity. So we use different terms, and we're trying to overcome that to show that we are trying to do the same thing. We are doing the same thing, but it's really hard when you're against a team that, again, is so united and so crystal clear and consistent with their messaging and their tactics, and they have a lot of money. So it's hard. Oh no. Hi.
Is it the
This
turtleneck?
is my friend. I've known Fareed forever.
Good afternoon. My name is Fareed. I'm coming as a student from Columbia, so I made the way all the way down here.
Wow. You're on sabbatical, right, sir?
I am on sabbatical from the State Department.
That's great.
So my question actually is, how do you deal with skeptics inside of the building?
Yeah.
And I know you touched on this earlier, but the State Department is made up of so many different kinds of people with different
Yep.
backgrounds,
Yep.
ideas. all passionate about whatever it is that they are passionate about. And the issue that you mentioned is something that is very polarizing. So how have you dealt with it, both in the State Department and potentially in the executive? And then let's just keep it to that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and
Another
thanks for
softball.
coming. I know, right? You know, again, I took this position very clear-eyed about the challenges and obstacles I would face. I would say I was surprised because I thought I kind of knew who to expect the resistance from, but I feel like I have been blindsided with from resistance from those I assumed would be sort of natural allies, right? But you know, I'm scrappy. I am resilient. In one of his last columns, my grandfather said, you know, we are a resilient people, resilient and resourceful people. And every time I am fronted with an obstacle, I just repeat that. We are resilient and resourceful people. And I just remind myself that I'm here to do this job. And being able to quote the secretary's words about why he created this position has been helpful. Being able to quote President Biden on why addressing racial discrimination and inequality and xenophobia is a national security issue has been helpful. Nonetheless, there are going to be people that you can't convert. And, you know, I had someone recently kind of give me this advice, which I think was helpful, was sobering, but it was like, you have to, in this role, you have to determine how much of your energy you want to expend on overcoming that resistance versus doing the actual work. And for me, it's much more important to do the work and have an impact and really institutionalize this work, because I'm really honored to be the first, but I don't want to be the last, and that's what keeps me up at night.
Is it a political position or?
Yes.
Can we come up to the front here? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Today I speak as a South African,
Okay.
and not on behalf of the UN. I think as a South African, I just want to know, you know, as a beneficiary of a global anti-racist movement, which was very, very strong.
Yeah.
And thanks to people like Gay who were part of it. I accepted this post because I'm trying to understand what happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, what happened? You look around the world, something is going on. And I keep asking myself, is it about the race as a construct, you know, a social construct to obtain certain outcomes? And what are the outcomes that the world wants to get now? And Gay is absolutely correct, because it's a global, there's a global movement around it. But as I say, there was a strong global movement against race and racial discrimination. And the UN was part of it.
Yep.
So to have to be appointed as the Secretary General's first special advisor on race in the workplace, I'm just in a, I have serious questions.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, at least you work around the world, so maybe you can tell us what's happening in the world. Thanks.
Are there any easy questions in the
No,
audience?
apparently not.
That it's something that I grapple with a lot. Like why, you know, a lot of the challenges that, again, we're facing in the United States, but also around the world, are the same challenges that my grandfather spent his life fighting against. And for me, that's frustrating. But on the other hand, it gives me hope, because I know at least I'm not starting from scratch. But something, I saw a really good documentary recently called Who We Are by Jeffrey Robinson. And we actually screened it at the UN a few months ago. And it's focused on the story of racial discrimination in the United States, but I think it's relevant for this work globally. And what he does is he goes through the history of the United States since the first ships with enslaved Africans came here in 1619, until the Civil War, until Reconstruction, until all these things. And he breaks them up into these time periods, and he talks about these time periods where there are great moments of progress, and then a tipping point where there's a severe backlash. And his argument is that we are now at that tipping point. Are we going to roll back like we have done in previous times? for me, the one I always think of is Reconstruction. Like if Reconstruction actually succeeded, the United States would look completely different. We wouldn't be having this conversation. And he argues that we are in that moment now. And it's not going to naturally go over the tipping point to a better place, right? It very well could slip back, but it won't slip back if it faces the resistance of people like you, like all of us in this room who are committed to it. And I'm hoping that if we actually get over this tipping point this time, this will be the last one. But I don't know. I don't know, because it is so insidious. And that is what makes this work. This work is extremely rewarding, but it's also very hard. And it's very draining, because you see people be demonized, be marginalized, be completely stripped of their dignity and their rights simply because of their race or ethnicity. I mean, that is, for me, is just hard to understand. It's hard to fathom. It's, but it is the unfortunate reality around the world. I've yet to travel to a country or talk to someone where they say, nope, we don't have this in my country, right? A person from the majority could say that, from the dominant class could say that, but then I guarantee you, if you talk to someone else, they have a different picture of reality. So it's very, it can be very depressing, but then I also focus on the wins, on what we actually have accomplished. And that gives me hope. But again, the sort of change is not going to come naturally. It has to only, it'll be hard fought, and it has to be fought with resistance.
Do we have time for one more question? I know Larry's had his hand up. Great.
Thank you,
It's on.
Lawrence Moss. So I'm delighted by the creation of your mandate and wish you every success. And pardon me for sharing a difficult question that happens to be on my mind this week. But last week the administration shockingly withdrew the nomination of Jim Carvalho to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, not because of anything that would fall within that role, but because of his own personal views on Israel-Palestinian issues. And these issues do come squarely within your mandate, whether there is and to what extent there's marginalization of Palestinians. How do you begin to navigate that? Do you have to, this must send a chilling effect throughout the administration. Do you avoid those issues completely? Do you have to try and find a way in which you can address them?
Yeah, I mean, talk about a hard question. That is the perennial question. That's a really, really difficult one. The administration's position is that every human being, whether they are Israeli or Palestinian, should be afforded equal rights and dignity. And that is our position. And that is what that's been my guiding light. But this has been a really, really, really hard one to navigate. And I'm going to just leave it there.
Well, with that final softball of a question, thanks to everyone, and thank you, Special Representative.
Thank you.